This collection of folks will be able to share a lot of analytics and metrics and a few projections and more that'll be beneficial to your wholesale operation. So without further ado, Ricky Beggs.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that. And just to clarify a little bit, when he said it was lively and so forth, there were no tomatoes thrown at anybody, so we hope that doesn't happen in this case either. Welcome to this session dealing with wholesale values and some residual forecasting and talk about the market. We've definitely got the industry's leading analyst up here on the panel today to bring some insight to you. And I look forward to hearing what their insight is and see if they say the same thing this session that they said last session, or if they said, whoa, wait a minute, let's change this topic a little bit. But, I think we need to give thanks to Bill and Nick and the whole auto remarketing team for a tremendous conference they put on. I've been here since Monday. And it's been unbelievable, some of the sessions and the conversations and the networking. Tremendous opportunity to be here for sure. It's an honor for me to be back here and to lead this panel. I've sat on that table for a while. Now I get to stand here and there's no pressure on this side except to ask the right question, and hopefully we'll do that. And to get to that right question, I actually reached out to about 36 people in the industry a few weeks back and asked them, if you were sitting in this session, what would you want to hear? And the feedback we got hopefully will lead it to the questions that we answer and the topics that we discuss being the things that are of interest that will help you in your business going forward. And so we'll get to that in just a second. But let me start with just introducing the panelists. And I'm going to do this alphabetically. Richard Arca here immediately next to me is the Associate Director of Pricing at Edmunds. He's been there about 9 years. His previous experience was with Toyota Financial, NMAC, and Mazda as well. And I also asked each of the panelists, what was one interesting thing, a fun fact, or something that nobody here probably knew about you? And Richard gave me a couple. One of them was that he had perfect attendance in middle school and high school. I don't know who would want to go to school every day, but I think that shows his dedication to when he sets his mind to something, he's going to succeed at it. And I think that's the case in his career now with as an analyst in the industry as well. Another thing that he did, so you don't want to throw anything at him, he could actually bench press 2.5 times his weight at one time. So let's
just to let you know, I was 16 years old. I was bench pressing 335, and I weighed 135 at the time.
Yeah, that's still pretty impressive, though. I don't think I could have ever come close to that. And Jonathan Banks on the other end of the table, and we've got them separated for a reason. I don't know what that reason is, but we've got them separated. But Jonathan is with NADA, been there about 7 or 8 years. Prior to that, he was with ALG, so he's seen the forecasting side, he's seen the used side, he's seen the finance side of the values as well. And Jonathan is the Vice President of Vehicle Analysis and Analytics. And one of the things that he in his bio says he has his MBA from Pepperdine. I don't know if I could ever accomplish getting an MBA at Pepperdine with the view from that school up there on the hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean. But an interesting thing about Jonathan, he's a baseball fan for sure, but he's also a fan of collecting baseball cards. He's been doing it for about 40 years. So in other words, he was a mere infant when he started there collecting baseball cards. But he's got a couple of cards from around 1940, and I think that's a Ted Williams and a Joe DiMaggio. Wow, that's
from
pretty
my
impressive.
grandpa. He got me hooked on baseball.
Yeah, no. But I might have some of those cards, but my mom threw the box away when I went to college. So anyway, I'm glad you've got them anyway. And our next person on the panel is Anil Goyal. Anil took some of my responsibilities at Black Book plus a whole lot more, and we're glad to have him with the team. He first joined us as a consultant, now full-time leading the analytics and team at Black Book. He has a PhD in decision sciences. And an interesting thing about Anil, he doesn't have time to do this anymore if he's going to do half of what I was doing. He likes to travel. He's been to over 25 countries visiting the world, all around the world. And maybe they'll give you a little time off and you can still travel some more. And better idea, just take it, okay? And our next person is Alain Nana-Sinkam. I hope I got that right. Did I get it right that time, Alain?
Yes, you got it.
Good deal. And Alain is with ALG, but he spent time in the finance industry and also the retail industry, HSB Finance, Wells Fargo before joining ALG a couple of years ago. But prior to that, he worked in the journalism industry for a little bit, and he had the opportunity to interview, and you might correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking he's probably the tallest player in the NBA ever, Manute Bol.
Ever, yep.
7 feet 8 inches tall. So even as tall as Alain is, he had to look up to him. But I thought that would be an interesting thing to have done, to sit there and talk with him. And what was it you said earlier when he was measured?
Well, two things. One, he said that his passport has him listed at 5'7" because they measured him sitting in a chair.
Tape measure wasn't long enough.
Yeah, and I think he tickled my elbow when he shook my hand. His hand was so good.
Oh, man. Well, what an experience that would have been as well. And our final panelist is sitting right there in the middle is A.J. Schoonover. A.J. is the Senior Manager of Vehicle Valuations Operations at Kelley Blue Book. And prior to that, he was in the retail business, the fleet side of the business as well, and even some of the internet dealer sales and marketing experiences. And then at Kelley, he's worked in the auction side of the business for a while and now is the Senior Manager of Vehicle Valuations Operations. One of the interesting things about AJ is he and his wife are currently training for their first marathon, and that's going to be on Super Bowl Sunday. So when you're sitting there watching the Super Bowl, you can go back and think, did he finish? And hopefully he did.
Okay.
And
Hopefully.
Hopefully you did. And on the same day.
We'll see.
That's good. That's good. So that's a little bit about our panelists and with their background. Let's get started and see what some of these questions are. And at some point, if you got a question, raise your hand. And if the lights aren't too bright, I'll try to call on you then. But let's just get started with a couple of questions. And we may touch on some of the questions from the first session. We may just skip over some of those and go to some new questions as well. But 2015 new vehicle sales seem to be on a path for record levels. And I think it's pretty understood that that's going to happen. Why are the sales levels exceeding all the forecasts prior to the year? And are these sales levels due to over-incentivized programs?
I think the economy is doing better. It's improved, and also we're still feeling the effects of the pent-up demand that took place during the recession. If you take a look at the pre-recession years, at least 2005, 2006, and 2007, each year averaged about 16.5 million cars. So in that 3-year span, about 49.5 million vehicles were sold. Then you take a look at the recession years, 2008, 9, and 10, that averaged roughly about 11.5 million per year, so 34.5 million vehicles. That's a 15 million vehicle difference right there. And being in this market right now, with the rich selection of cars, great incentives, especially low interest rates, it's a great time to buy a brand new vehicle. And on top of that, with the used market being as strong as it is, used car values are higher, resale values are higher, which gives it all the more reason for someone to go buy in a new car.
Yeah, and I think the second part of that, the incentive piece, is the part that's concerning. We've seen historically that consumers become very accustomed to high levels of incentives. So as we move into a phase of the industry that we all agree is going to feature a flattening sales environment, having consumers that are accustomed to those incentives and the need to increase those incentives is really the point of concern, and I think that all the panelists agree it's one of the things that we have to look at most closely.
Yeah, I think, going back on what Alan said, eventually incentives get so consistent that the public or the consumers begin to realize, well, this is a pretty good rebate company, and I'm just going to wait till the rebates get better, then I'm going to jump in and buy.
All right, let me say this. We talked about incentives, of course, but now is this incentive on the car itself or the finance side? Is there a difference there? AJ?
I'd say both. So we see, well, going back, so the new car, we're going to land about 17.4 this year, and which is the 6th consecutive year of fundamental growth on the new car side from a sales perspective. And that's a 6% increase from last year. And so that's some pretty big numbers of 17.4. But yeah, incentives are up. We're seeing about $3,100 on average for the month of October per vehicle. And that's about a 9% incentive to ATP ratio. So that's up month over month. So that's a little concerning to Alan's point. And but yeah, leases, so incentives are up. That demand is absolutely there, and that I would say that demand's primarily from the leases coming back. So we have all those leases coming back, and those customers are trying to get back into another lease, and so dealers are seeing that as an opportunity to lease more cars. And obviously, with the high retention and the high residuals, we see some really attractive leases with those great incentives, obviously, as well. And so, yeah, the leasing is definitely a piece of that. And then from an economy standpoint, we're at 5% unemployment. So there's a lot of people employed. Income is not up, but there's a lot of people employed in the market right now.
Yeah, I would say, incentives alone wouldn't have brought us from 10 million in 2009 to 17 million now. The underlying reason for that is really the retail demand. As AJ was mentioning about the economy, unemployment rate has really gone down. 3 years ago, when we were talking about millennials not buying cars, now we're talking how they consider cars as their expression of their personality and what they want in the car. So, they're getting back out from their basements of their parents and try to get into new cars. So that has been the primary driver, and the other the factor that's supporting that has been the credit industry. The credit availability has been extremely high with the all-time low APRs, longer terms, and relaxing criteria. So you hear about subprime going gangbusters in terms of volume. That has really supported the demand that's been there. Incentives largely, I would say, have been very strategic over this last few years. Granted that this year we've started to see them spill over into more cash programs. I mean, you hear, about Friends and Neighbors program and all those kind of things now coming in. So, we're starting to make more headlines around that, and it is going to be a concern going forward. I think we all agree on that one, that, with this volume at 17.3, and the manufacturers kind of aiming to do more and more, they can't do that because the demand is going to mature, and incentives is what's going to, drive that sales if they want to achieve that sales target.
Hey, Jonathan, we'll come back to you in just a second on that. But, Neil, I want to ask you one other thing. With the financing that you mentioned, the longer terms, buying deeper into subprime, is that creating the perfect storm?
I think, you could say that's a very ominous thing we're doing. We're trying to take advantage of the situation and not thinking about the future, and loaning to people who don't deserve it, or getting them into longer term loans when we know they're going to be in negative equity situation. I think if you look at each of those metrics one at a time, there are facts behind them as to why they are there. Longer term loans, if you look at, the cars are lasting longer, and it actually helps balance some of the used supply that's going to come in early, in the 2 to 3 year time frame when you have longer term loans. So the two kind of balance each other out. From a lending perspective, the delinquency rates are just extremely low, and after the recession, household balance sheet looks really, really good, with the debt service to income ratio being very low. So individually, when you take those factors, I think you can make sense out of it. But you're right that we are increasing risk in the system, and we're going to be less prepared to handle a shock. So if everything looks good and economy continues to improve, I think we're all going to be heroes, right? But when we have a shock in the economy, the risk that has been created is going to be more severe.
Jonathan, you can touch on either one of those, or both of them.
First of all, LMC forecasted sales to be 17.4 million this year, and most analysts at the beginning of the year were somewhere around 17. So everyone saw the demand, obviously, that we were going to have a really good year. When you think about the growth, though, back to the leasing, the growth that we've seen in 2015 has primarily been growth in leasing. 68% of the growth that we've seen in 2015 is driven by increase in lease. So it is what it is. We're in an environment where resale values are really high and interest rates are really low, and those are the two variables that create a lease payment. So it's pretty natural. To the point of the longer-term loans, another, besides making it affordable, well, it's not only affordable for the customer. Right now, it's affordable for the banks because the cost of funds are so low. So to me, not surprising that we're into longer-term loans, coupled with the durability that Anil talked about. Vehicles last longer. So someone in a 72-month loan, at the end of the loan, that vehicle still has value. What we found in looking at the longer-term loans, usually that customer is going to come back anyway at around 60, after around 65 months. So extending the loan probably won't have a real material impact on pulling the consumer out of the regular cadence that we've seen during the past few years. If you go back a long time ago when vehicle durability was really questionable, then you're really running into issues where you know, a longer-term loan will be really deleterious for the consumer because their vehicle's worth nothing at the end of the loan. But now it makes sense. To me, my whole problem with everything is, if I were to cite a problem, is lease subventions just, I think, too high. When you look at average incentives broken out by type, cash is like, it's really flat and actually very reasonable, somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500. That's before all the programs that we're seeing now. But lease it's creeping up above $5,500. And when you think about $5,500, it's not a big deal when you're talking about a lease subvention on a S-Class or a 7 Series. But when you're talking about subvention on a Fusion or a Malibu or a Camry, they're spending quite a bit to get that payment at $199. So that to me is where the surprise is hey, we're at 17.4, but there's a cost.
AJ, right now, the current used market activity and retention has been very, very strong. Mm-hmm. Contrary to supply levels that we've talked about, how much is out there in the industry. What's driving the market trends and strength right now, and when's that going to change?
So I would say CPO has a big impact. So there's a lot of vehicles coming off lease that the upstream channel is taking a lot of that supply out. And so the captives really are driving their dealers to take those grounding dealers to take those vehicles and certify those vehicles. And so we hit quarter after quarter, month after month, we hit CPO records. And so they don't see them, you don't see as many in the auction lanes. But when you do see cars in the auction lanes, it's a good mix. It's not the vehicles that they don't want that aren't equipped properly. It's the vehicles that are doing very well from a retention standpoint. And then you also talk about fleets. So the fleet market is getting very intelligent on their business, of the balance of running the balance of their business and renting out cars or using their fleet, and also selling that fleet at certain times to balance that approach of when those cars come back, so that they don't make a huge impact from a residual standpoint or from a resale standpoint. So we're getting a lot smarter on how we exactly bring those cars to market and when we do bring those cars back to market.
Yeah, let me just go and add to what AJ said. You know, our data shows that used car prices are at an all-time high right now, roughly about 18,600 roughly, and we can attribute that to an increased share of newer used vehicles. So that brought up the value right there.
Yeah, I would second that. We look at the overall market in a 3-year retention period. So looking at a 2012 model year vehicle in October of 2015, we had the average retention at 51.2%, which is an all-time high. And it has been kind of around that range for the last 3 years. Pre-recession, that number was more like 43%. So, we're substantially about 8 percentage points higher in terms of retention. And we're talking about what has been driving that. It's really been the demand, that has been growing with the economy improving. But when you have new car sales at 10 million, new car-based sales essentially create used supply, and so that used supply has been lagging behind, the demand number. So we haven't seen that crossover yet, but we're expecting to see that, demand and supply crossover more like in the late next year. So that's what's kept up the demand. The price is high.
Alan, let me let you address this next one first, if you would. During the last major downturn in the used market, that came at a time when leasing was peaking out at right at 30% of the sales in the marketplace. The used market was considered flooded back then, and the values and the losses on those residual forecasts were tremendous. It actually put some leasing companies out of business, for sure. What's different today about that? Better residual forecasting, strength of CPO? What else is out there that's going to help in that retention value?
So I'd say that there are three things that I would touch on. I think the first one is that our ability as an industry to remarket vehicles is much more sophisticated this time around. Much higher ability to understand market trends and use analytics to make sure that cars are positioned where they need to be positioned to maximize returns. I think from a valuation standpoint, we've all had the opportunity to observe a sufficient amount of post-recession data to really understand what constitutes this new normal in terms of an environment. And I think that that's extremely impactful to understand what's going to happen as we go through the extended portions of this cycle. And then the third thing that I would say is that lenders are starting to become more sophisticated in understanding the loan-to-value equation and recognizing that in reality, the loan-to-value at the time of origination is the most useless loan-to-value percentage. It's not the one that you ever interact with when you're taking a loss. And being able to understand that you have to take into account the depreciation outlook for every piece of collateral, and you can't just say 115 a wholesale or 100% of NADA retail or whatever the policy is. You have to be more sophisticated than that. Those are all things that I think make the environment very different this time around.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'll give props to the manufacturers. They've been designing products at a quicker cadence. They've been investing a lot more money in technology and the redesigns. So if you look at a history of redesigns and you look at the current period to 3 years out, there's this year and next year, they're talking about 100 redesigns or refreshes. But actual redesigns, it's about 50 for the current period. If you go back to the period during the last downturn, the cadence of redesigns was significantly less. So that pool of used cars that came back during the early 2000s and late 90s were not of incredibly good quality and not very appealing from a design standpoint. So the pool of vehicles...
Were they considered old?
Well, yeah, I mean, back then, think about one thing when I think about the quality of the vehicles and I look at what's like an indicator to tell me that quality's changed besides like the easy stuff where, like you look at our metrics of vehicle dependability and problems per 100. If you go back about 10 years, they're about half for vehicle dependability, and the deviation between the manufacturers is much smaller. So pretty much quality by all manufacturers is significantly greater. But then I look at the engagement on the franchise dealer side, which if you think about franchise dealers historically, they didn't really want to touch used vehicles, or they touched them, very carefully. They liked off-lease returns, but really didn't touch anything with any over 100,000 miles. That engagement has changed dramatically because of the quality of the vehicles. So you have more engagement from franchise dealers, independent dealers, and it all comes down to the fact that the pool of vehicles is just extraordinarily better than what we faced before. Now there's other dynamics that are similar, but this one definitely is unique.
I think the other thing about manufacturer strategy has been also the CPO program, embracing the CPO program and really listening to the dealers and helping them be prepared for that. So those lease returns that are coming back are much easily absorbed. They are contained within the franchise network, and there are good programs around having extra clean vehicle with all those inspections and supporting that need in the consumer world where somebody is not ready yet to buy a new vehicle, but they want the peace of mind. So I think there's been a great marketing as well as support for that program that has helped in this era versus where we had 2 decades ago.
Okay. Let's change it back to kind of the current market, unless somebody wants to add another comment.
Just one thing. Yeah, go ahead, AJ.
I just want to add, I agree with everyone, what everyone said, but also at that point, when the used car market was so flooded, we were flooded in the wrong vehicles because we had gas prices at $4 a gallon, and so we had excess supply of these trucks and SUVs that had really low demand at that same point. And so if we talk about a perfect storm, that was the perfect storm at that point, because all that lease volume was coming back and no one wanted it. And so that's what happened at that point in time. We've done a lot of research going back to look at what exactly the factors were, and absolutely excess supply and low demand because of those fuel prices and all that volume coming back.
That was a different downturn, though. There's two downturns, right? There's one in 2009 where we went into the panic and our economy collapsed, and there's the other downturn where used vehicle values lost about 14% in a 3-year period. In a good economy, back in the day when we thought our economy was recession-proof, remember that? That's when we had the downturn. Now, granted, 9/11, caused some havoc, but before 9/11, if you remember, one reason we leased, and we loved leasing in the early to mid-90s, is because used values always went up. They didn't go down. It was used cars were an inflationary asset in that a 3-year-old vehicle 1 year, the following year would be worth more, which kind of makes sense because it's a life cycle thing. But we saw a 14% reduction in the next 3 years in an economy that was arguably really good. The downturn AJ's referring to was just a total disaster. Yep. I mean, that's where you had irrational consumer behavior because gas prices hit $4 and because people really didn't think they're going to have any jobs.
You had two major opposite reactions in the marketplace within about 5 or 6 months, I believe, if that's correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to where you said, AJ, in the perfect storm kind of deal and the mix of vehicles there. All right, what about going forward? What about the level of leases today? Cars, trucks, utilities, where are we there? And is that going to be different for us going forward with these 30% of leases, 28% of the market being leases? How's that going to affect the market going forward with some of the retention and some of the forecasts?
I think the leases right now, it's based on consumer demand. I mean, so consumers are demanding the crossovers. So the crossover segment, the compact crossover segment, I should say, is the largest selling segment this year. So it surpassed midsize cars this year for the first time. Midsize cars has been the top selling segment year over year. And so there's a lot of leases in that segment, and there's a lot of leases in the right segments because they're selling those cars. As Jonathan stated, all the increase of sales is primarily due to excess leasing and all those leases generated. And one thing to note is the pickup trucks. We haven't seen the increase of leases in the pickup trucks like we saw back in 2005 and 2006 during that time when they came back in 08 and 09. And so we haven't seen that incremental increase in the pickup truck segments. And we don't forecast fuel to increase for the foreseeable future. So we think that fuel is going to stay relatively low. I think last month we were at 230 average across the United States. So we expect somewhere at that level to continue for the foreseeable future.
You mentioned fuel prices. I know this is not one of the prepared ahead of time questions, but I'm sure it's something you use in your forecasting. Where do you think fuel prices are going to be in the next year, 3 years, 5 years?
Well, we use the forecast from Energy Information Administration, and the projection for the next year is $2.50 on average, with the seasonality, of course, going up in the summertime and then declining in the wintertime.
And the consistent thing with the EIA's forecast, which we use as well, is they're always wrong. So, and every gas price forecast is always wrong.
Right.
So we live in a mentality right now where gas prices are going to be low forever. But guess what? I'm banking right now next year when we talk, gas prices are going to be higher, along with interest rates and used supply.
If any of you follow me on Facebook,
I can say that definitively.
yeah, if any of you follow me on Facebook, you've seen some pretty low gas prices that I've paid from time to time.
Gas prices are driven by, we can pretend like they're based on fundamentals, but they're not. We know that in April and May, there's going to be a seasonal uptick in gas prices. But from long term, production, the fact that we have more production, should keep things more in check. We're probably not looking at $4,
Right.
but we're probably looking at something more than what we're paying today.
But in your forecast, what are you planning for, Alain?
We use the best I think all of us use, I don't think any of us up here are fuel price prognosticators. I think we all use third party, and EIA is pretty flat.
That's right. We're all using and trying to understand who's the most accurate and timely. I think what the big challenge is, and Jonathan got at it a little bit, and I'd be interested in the group's opinion on it, is how do you understand the psychological impact of gas? If you look at like alt fuel vehicles, which we believe is a down segment, is going to face some pressure. We know that if you sit down with a calculator and try and justify, for instance, the excess costs of a Tesla, you're not buying that car because it's going to save you a ton of money in terms of your energy expense. So it's not necessarily a dollars and cents thing that drives consumer behavior when gas price changes. So what is that? What is that impact, and how do you understand why when, and I told this story the other day, when Katrina hit, I drove to work past a gas station, the price was $2.35. I drove home, it was $3.45 on that particular day. We know that impacts consumers more than just the impact of an extra dollar a gallon per gas in your monthly budget. Although I know it's meaningful, I don't want to understate it. It's meaningful for a lot of people, but there are many more people who react to it than the ones that are just directly impacted from an economic standpoint.
And I'm sure everyone else, I'll be really quick, but we spent a lot of time looking at the impact, a change, to your point, and Alan, the change in gas prices is what impacts it. When you go back to 2011, a big change in gas price would actually shift demand from, depending on the direction, obviously, shift away from small cars to trucks or vice versa. And you'd actually see price movement based on that change in gas prices. And that occurred in 2011. It occurred in 2012. When we got to 13 and 14, we didn't see that sort of movement anymore. So either A, prices were low enough that consumers didn't change their buying behavior, or B, consumers realized that, like Alan realized when he was driving to work and home, that gas price movement is not predictable, and I should never base a long-term decision on fluctuations in gas prices, which I believe is probably the majority of it. Consumers are desensitized to gas price movements.
All right, I mentioned earlier that I reached out to the industry, some of my industry contacts from the past, and said, what interests you, what would you like to hear about? And just about every one of those feedbacks that came to me talked about recalls, what the effect was on the current market, on future market, on forecasting market, and specifically it talked about Volkswagen's situation now. What's different about this recall with Volkswagen, and how are you looking at those market trends and values and forecast?
Well, in general, if you look at recalls from the past, there's been so many of them that I think consumers have kind of come to expect it. And we do see in some cases a temporary reduction in value, but more or less those values come back, and there's not a long-term, long-lasting impact. Now, Volkswagen case is a little bit different, and I would say two specific ways it's different where, most recalls tend to be safety related, and consumers have in their best interest to get that fixed. But even those recalls, I mean, the best case scenario is 70% get fixed. I mean, on average, it's even lower. The situation here is it's not clear what's in consumers' interest to get that car fixed when they do announce that, that fix, whether it's a hardware and software or whatever that fix is. So there's a lot of uncertainty around it, but Volkswagen will really have to try to incent that customer to get that car fixed. And then the second is, of course, a lot of these recalls tend to get characterized as, it was an oversight or a mistake, and when we are here to correct it, so they can actually build up on that factor that, we are here to make amends here. But in Volkswagen case, of course, they've come out and said it was intentional. So, it has that brand impact, and more so from a brand impact, it's got a significant financial impact to the company overall, which I worry is that it's going to drive attention away from product innovation and the long-term strategy to more towards damage control and how do we make sure that the company continues.
Any other thoughts on that?
I think that what Anil talked about in terms of the nature of the fix is probably most critical. With all of these other events, the assumption was that here's a defect, bring your car in, we're going to address it, and then your car is whole again, and it's working as intended. There's a distinct possibility in this case that whatever fix is applied could render these vehicles less competitive, performance could be impacted, fuel economy could be impacted. That's a whole different set of post-fix concerns that aren't present in the other types of events that we've studied.
Yeah, exactly. At Edmunds, we're kind of holding the hammer until we see what kind of fix Volkswagen has. I mean, hopefully they can fix the emissions problem and the vehicle can have or retain all the characteristics that I like about it. Again, and not to put anything down about emissions, but emissions might be the fourth place concern in my reason to buy that vehicle. I'm more concerned with the fuel economy that car is going to give me and the engine performance, and I think that'll hopefully still be there. But, again, that's my preference, and that's not, again, not to put down emissions concerns.
But I don't think the federal government's thinking of that.
Yeah.
No.
Exactly.
When you look at recalls historically, the only recall that really has a material impact, had a material impact on used values was Toyota with the unintended acceleration, and it was quite significant. And I believe that they still even had some negative residual effect even today. But when you think about how that recall was handled, it was handled poorly at first with the communication to the consumers. There was a lot of denying, which granted, I know as it panned out, Toyota was probably right. But regardless, the media grabbed onto it. If you remember, back during Toyota unintended acceleration, either they were talking about it on the screen or it was running on the little banner underneath. And then we did a study on the amount of mentions for the recall for Toyota, and the mentions on the internet were huge. Where you go and look at GM, even though it seemed like a big deal to us because we're in the industry, from actual media grabbing it and using it and talking about it and making it a daily thing that customers would see, there was no real impact like that. And we didn't see an impact in used prices, which was surprising being that it was a safety issue. But for VW, to me, one thing that is really frightening from a used car value standpoint, and this is short term, maybe not from a residual standpoint, because we could probably all conclude that VW is going to survive this. VW is like the pinnacle of industry for Germany. They're not going to let it go, just like we wouldn't let Ford or GM go. But short term, the prices on used vehicles for diesels are going to get hurt, but pretty badly. They still haven't figured out how to fix the Gen 1 model, which doesn't even have the technical components to be able to fix the vehicle. So when you read about it, they're talking about cutting holes in the sheet metal and doing all this crazy stuff. And so that presents a problem, right? It presents a problem not only in what's this going to do to my vehicle, but how long is it going to take to fix my vehicle? The dealers are going to look at diesels, and are you kidding? If you're a dealer, are you going to want a diesel trade-in right now? No way. So short term, there's serious implications. Long term, I hope to see that VW, really makes their customers, takes away all that risk from them. They started out with these gift cards, which I think is symbolic, but they need to do something real to get through this without taking a perception hit.
AJ, current hit on Volkswagen product. You got any numbers there, and what do you think is going to happen more longer term?
Yep. So current hit is about 16, 18%, albeit there's lower volume in the marketplace right now from an auction perspective because there's some stop sales. But I tend to agree with Jonathan. It's going to subside a little bit, and so that's just the hit right now. So once the press and the media and Volkswagen figures out the remedy, as long as that remedy is not going to affect performance, but it probably will, it's going to subside a little bit from that 16 to 18% benchmark right now.
Yeah, one thing from a long-term standpoint, if you think about worst-case scenario, the diesel premium is just gone.
right now.
I mean, that could potentially happen 3 years down the road. That Gen 1 diesel is worth the same as gas. Likely won't get less than gas, but, you know, that could be. And diesel premiums have been huge.
The other aspect of it is AJ mentioning that, these vehicles are not coming to the market, they're not being sold at dealerships or at the auctions, so you have a supply kind of building up. So when that fix comes, you would have that supply, and what impact will that have on the market?
Any questions from the audience at this point? All right, we got one right here, Nick. And while Nick's heading that way, gosh, what insight the panelists have offered us so far. We're getting down toward the end, but if you've got questions, I think we'll stay here. We'll lock the door and keep the other people out. Now your question.
Thanks, guys. This is great. So this is for Jonathan, talking about the issue of quicker redesigns and the impact that has. And if I express this intelligently, I'll be shocked. So apologies in advance. But if we quicken the cycle of kind of upping the game on quality, does that necessarily push down the value of the previous generations and something will become antiquated more quickly and prices will go down more quickly on the sort of previous generations of the same?
Depending on the
car?
strategic execution of that redesign, the opposite will occur because you have the opportunity to increase your transaction prices on that redesign model. Now, there's a natural loss of value, which, let's just say, rule of thumb is about 1% per year of your life cycle. So, like, when you run a 7-year life cycle, you're going to lose, it's 1% actually relative to your competition. So you'll lose 7% of your competitive positioning. But when you launch a new redesign, if it's effective, if it's not ugly and you didn't screw up somehow, if it's effective, you should be able to raise your transaction price, and that should have a halo effect on your used vehicles. And you see it time and time again. That's more the case than not. If you mess up with your pricing, if you mess up with your volume, if you mess up with your design, and you have to do some repricing and weird things on that new vehicle, yeah, that's where the danger comes in. But generally speaking, it's a good thing.
Thank you.
Just to add to what Jonathan was saying, I think the one segment that would probably get hurt might be the technology-driven sectors, such as the EV vehicles. Again, right now, I think the average EV range is probably 100 miles or so, but imagine 2 years down the road, they're now producing EV vehicles that have 200-mile ranges. What does that do to the value of the EV cars now? That's almost like asking, imagine a 4-cylinder car getting 8-cylinder economy. No one's going to want that vehicle.
Any other questions back here in the group?
Gentlemen, we'll try to squeeze one more in.
Okay.
Actually, my next question was about EV vehicles. So what is the forecast for volume and pricing for EVs and hybrids?
Well, we see negative pressure on alternative fuel vehicles because of some of the trends that the panel has already discussed. We feel like the window is starting to close a little on the competitive advantage that those vehicles presented in a higher fuel price environment. It was never at the transaction prices, as we've said, a matter of dollars and cents and being able to make the economic case for driving an alt fuel vehicle. But as that gap starts to widen and gasoline variants become good enough for the economic part of that equation, we expect to continue to see pressure on alt fuel vehicle values.
Yeah, and again, to add to that, there's going to be a lot of pressure with the manufacturers because EV and hybrid vehicles, they rely heavily on tax credits and rebates to get them sold. And once that's gone, the residual values plummet. Now, what happens when the tax credits get reduced or goes away? It's going to put a lot of pressure on the manufacturers to reduce that price.
Yeah, we see the volume to remain low. Right now, EV and hybrids together is about 3% of the market, and most of the manufacturers, that are bringing out EVs are really, doing that to serve their need for the zero-emission states, vehicle states where they're required to sell. So it's really being driven from that regulatory aspect to meet some of the supply and the demand on EVs is not really there, so the volume is going to be low. And you can see that, when you have more supply than the demand, for example, Nissan Leaf, it took a big hit. As long as the demand and supply kind of gets matched, and you do have that product, but it's limited to where you need it strategically, I think we'll be okay.
There's a huge difference between the luxury EVs and the mainstream EVs. Luxury EVs have high retention. Mainstream EVs have really bad retention. And as far as sales go, our government, this is where I'll get a little political right now. The reason that EVs are popular is so the manufacturers can meet their CAFE standards. And the government, as you know, they're fairly aggressive targets moving forward. So are they going to use electric vehicles to hit those targets? They likely will. Supply will never match demand because in this case, this is not a supply-demand type of situation. This is a situation where manufacturers need to build and sell EVs because the government mandates it. Is it a good thing? I would argue, yeah, it's a great thing, but consumers don't want them, and it gets to Alan's point. Consumers are unable to factor in. It's a fairly complicated equation in your head to factor in how much money am I going to save owning this EV for 5 years versus a gas engine. If gas prices do this and do that, there's like all kinds of variables that you need to do a regression model to figure it out, right? So the people that want EVs, the demand is for the ones that have emotional appeal. But that being said, we're going to continue to see more EVs in the mainstream so the manufacturers can hit their CAFE. They can only do so much with gas engines. I mean, they're doing everything they can. It's amazing what they're doing, but eventually they're going to need to have EVs to get that average that they need for CAFE.
And
No doubt about
we're
it.
really just about out of time. As the panelist, I thank you for what you've done. Give you one last shot in 10 words or less. What's the one thing you want to leave with the guests today? Jonathan? I'm going to count the words.
Watch new vehicle incentives and be afraid.
Anil?
I'd pick up a line from Yogi Berra: "The future ain't what it used to be."
AJ?
I would agree with Jonathan about the incentives. Watch incentives and also watch mixes. So you have to watch the mix of your vehicles.
Alan?
Yeah, this is a situation where it's really bad to go fourth or fifth because I feel exactly the same way. Incentives, incentives, incentives.
Okay.
Don't panic when gas prices go back up again. So.
All right. Give me a round of applause for the panel here. I think they did a wonderful job.